Oh, recording has started. So Talya is a senior lecturer at the Department of Community Mental Health at the University of Haifa in Israel. Although I think I actually saw on Twitter that you've just been appointed head of department from October. So congratulations.
Yes. Thanks.
So Talya studies trauma and its mental health consequences, especially using epidemiological methods and network approaches. So Talya is currently undertaking a sabbatical year at UCL, and obviously before the pandemic, we were hoping to host Talya in Bristol and in TARG for the day. But I'm really delighted that she's still able to join us remotely this afternoon. So if anyone's got any questions, just pop them in the chat and we can pick them up in the Q&A after the talk. So Talya, over to you.
Thanks. And also, if I say anything at any point that doesn't make much sense, feel free to, I don't know, somehow get my attention and I'll attempt to go back and clarify. So I'm now going to try and share my screen, which was not as straightforward as I hoped. There you go. Can you see that? Give me a wave if that works. Hannah, I can see you. All good? Okay.
I realised I was muted. I can't see it yet. It said you're receiving a presentation, but I can't see your screen.
All right, so I'm gonna start talking, and I hope that the presentation will come up. And if it doesn't, please just let me know that there's been some kind of issue.
Oh wait, no, sorry, that's because I switched the presentation off. It's there.
All right, good. So I'm going to attempt to race through a bit of an introduction to ecological momentary assessment or experience sampling methodology, and talk about how it can be used to monitor and assess mental health, and actually understand symptomatology and the way that symptoms interact with each other. And then I'm going to give a bit of an example of a study that I used EMA in to give you a sense of what you might be able to do with this kind of approach. So just to start, EMA or ESM, which also goes by all kinds of other names like daily diary studies and proximal intensive assessment and ambulatory assessment and others, what we're talking about is cases where you run a study where you collect repeated measures from people, usually at least 20 measures per person, sometimes hundreds or even thousands, and over a period of time, quite intensively. And it can be from one person or from lots of people, but the idea being that you are asking people or collecting data from people in their real world environments, in their everyday lives, and actually trying to capture something different than you might do from a lab. So really, how does kind of life in context take place, and how do these mental health symptoms in context, in their everyday context, occur? And so what we get is somebody answering questionnaires maybe once or twice a day, but potentially, like I said, could be up to 10 or 20 times a day about how they're feeling. And in the past, we did this with pencil and paper and literally diaries, daily diaries. Actually, these days, people are usually using mobile phones. For a while, they might have used a kind of special device, but for the most part now, people use phones or wearables to collect this kind of information. And they might be that one person does it over a few days, but what you often get are these N greater than 1 studies where you've got lots of people providing lots of data over a period of time. And the kind of data that they'll provide, I'll just go back here, you might get data that they're providing on a mobile phone. You might also get, for example, alcohol levels in their blood. You might want to measure their walking over a period of time. You might want to measure skin conductance or heart rates. So this gives you a chance to really combine self-report data, which I think most people are very familiar with more kind of objective or physiological measures that might be relevant for the research that you do. So the data end up in a kind of what we call long format, this long structure, where you might find that you've got one person repeated a number of times and then the next person repeated a number of times. And we get kind of person level variables that are static, that they don't change. So for example, the year of birth. The year of birth is a person level variable that won't change over time. But what you do get are these kind of measures where you might be asking the same question. For example, how happy do you feel right now? And on one measure, they'll say 0, but on the next measure, they'll say 3, and then they'll say 4. And we'll see that these variables vary within the person over time. So why do we do EMA studies? And I think EMA and ESM studies have become increasingly popular over the last few years, partly because they are doable, because we can now do them using mobile phones. But I think more importantly is because they do have this kind of added value of ecological validity. We're really getting at people in their everyday lives. And I think, for anybody who studies mental health, I mean, mental health only takes place really within the context of everyday lives and within the context of the impairment, within the context of the interactions with other people. So it's really critical to try and assess that experience within people's everyday lives. And we get the richness of the contextual and the environmental factors. And so you get a much richer picture, obviously, rather than an aggregate assessment, but you also reduce recall bias. It's a much more kind of robust assessment over their experiences over that time period. But I think most critically are these final two on this slide. The first is the dynamic processes. And what we get is, rather than, for example, traditional longitudinal research, you'll get, how does your state in 1 month predict your state 6 months later? Which is interesting and important, but actually, for me, what I find very interesting is understanding how your state at one point in time is related to your state some hours later. Because I think these kind of micro-longitudinal processes and this micro-longitudinal change is very, very relevant for the kinds of things that a lot of us study, whether it's emotions or psychiatric symptoms or interpersonal interactions. But all of these things, it makes sense to measure them in a kind of micro-longitudinal framework within a window of an hour or a day, rather than over months. And the other thing I think that's really important is a decomposition of what we call within-person and between-person processes. And I'll just take a minute to try and explain what I mean by that. The within-person is the change within a person. So rather than thinking about how one person compares to another person, that's the between-person. So people with very high levels of PTSD compared to people with lower levels of PTSD. What we're interested in looking at is the change within that person. What makes them change in terms of their levels of PTSD or depression or negative affect or whatever your variable of interest is? What's caused that change? How can we understand why there was a change now compared to the day before? What happened that made these differences? And the other thing that's really critical is actually that within person and between person processes don't necessarily follow the same rules. So I'm going to give a little example. This is an example from Ellen Hammaker, who's done a lot of work on the analysis of ESM data, this kind of micro-longitudinal data. And she says, if we think about somebody, to give a kind of an easy example, if we think about somebody who types, and we say to somebody, type faster, they're probably going to make more mistakes than they normally do if they're told to type faster than they usually type. But if we compare people at the average level, usually if somebody types faster, they usually make fewer errors. So you end up with this kind of graph where we have typing speed along one side and typing errors up here. And we see that if we look at the between persons level, the faster somebody types, the fewer typing errors that those people are likely to make. But if we look at the within person level, the faster somebody is asked to type, the more typing errors they will make than usual. And we can see that actually these processes can be completely opposite. And we often find that people tend to extrapolate from the between persons to the within persons level without really checking whether these processes hold true if we flip the level. So we can get at that kind of phenomenon via an ESM or an EMA design and understand whether the assumptions that we've made at that between persons level still hold true when we look at the within persons level. The other thing that's really critical to say is people aren't all the same. This is obvious, we know that already. But if we look, for example, over time, we might make the wrong assumption if we look just at their average level. So what we're looking at here is data, real data from an ESM study, and we're looking at their positive affect over, it's actually over 30 days, measured twice a day. And if we look, for example, at person 39, we'll see that they're quite variable and their mean level would probably be around here, let's say. And if we look at this person number 2, their mean level is also the same, but there's almost no variance in their responses. So we need to really look at this kind of more sensitively in a more nuanced way to understand what's going on, not just look at their mean level over time. but actually at this variance, and what does this variance or variability in their responses, does that mean anything? Is it useful for us to understand that? And can we get at some of the reasons that people will change? So in terms of the analyses, and I often get asked, what analysis should I use, or don't you always use HLM when you do an ESM study, or things like that? And the truth is that there's very many different ways that we can approach these kinds of data, and that both analytically as well as also the research question. And I think that the kind of analysis that somebody might choose to use is totally dependent on their research question. This is true in any kind of research. But some of the questions you might want to ask are, how do the variables vary within individuals? Or how do the variables change over time? Or how does the environment affect these variables? Or how does one variable predict another variable at the next measurement? Each of those questions requires a different analytic approach, sometimes very, very different approach. So again, in terms of a kind of one size fits all, that doesn't apply here, both in terms of the ways that you should ask the questions, and I can discuss that with anybody who's interested in running these kinds of studies later. But also in terms of the analytic approach, it's very different depending on your research question. So I'm going to talk a bit about research that I conducted. I've used ESM approaches in lots of different studies. As Hannah said, I'm normally based in Israel, and so I'm going to talk about a study that we conducted in Israel. And it's important for me just to say before I continue that because I'm normally based in Israel, the people that I normally have access to are Israelis. And I'm going to talk about a study that we collected during a conflict. This is not in any way intended to make any comment on the conflict, and also isn't in no way intended to say anything about the equivalency of distress in different populations. It is just the population that I had access to. So this particular study, the sample are Israeli civilians during the Israel-Gaza conflict, which took place in 2014. And that involved airstrikes and a ground invasion of Israeli forces into Gaza, and also involved rocket and mortar and tunnel attacks from Gaza to Israel. And what happened in Israel was that civilians, when there was a mortar or rocket attack, there'd be a warning siren, and people had between 15 to 90 seconds to safely find shelter before the expected rocket hit. So the data we're looking at in this study are people who were exposed to this rocket fire. It was two groups. One group were a general population sample, and one sample were a group that we recruited through psychiatric rehabilitation services. There were people with a diagnosis of a serious mental illness. So those were the two groups, and for 30 days we administered an 85-item ESM questionnaire. So that's over 9,000 questionnaires that we collected in total. So I'm going to just talk a bit about the kinds of things that we did with these data. We have done lots of follow-ups. We've actually run, this is actually out of date because in the last few weeks we've been running another follow-up with the same group, another EMA burst, kind of to get their coronavirus stress responses. But they did over, looking at these data, we had 30 days of twice daily responses, and we asked about lots of different things, including their exposure, but also about their PTSD symptoms, positive and negative emotions, sleep, social support, dissociation, positive psychosis symptoms, and lots of other kinds of things in that. So it's a very rich data set, and one that actually has still a lot of analysis to be done on it in case anybody's interested in discussing that further. And the kind of questions that we were interested in addressing were whether distress levels were stable over time, whether recovery looked the same for everyone, whether we could identify certain groups that had different patterns of response, and whether we could identify risk and resilience factors, among many other questions. And I think it's worth just kind of pausing to imagine this study in the current context, because I think the kinds of questions we had then, with an ongoing period of stress, with potentially some very specific stressors popping up in there. For that study that I'm talking about now, it was the exposure to the rockets. But I think now we can easily imagine a situation in which we could talk about this ongoing period of stress. But within that, there might be particular events, for example, COVID illness or illness of a relative, or particular changes in the lockdown rules that might be particular intense stressors during an ongoing stressful period. And I think that the questions we had then are really relevant to questions that people might have now. So I'm going to give really just a very, very short taster of some of our results, in a hope that this kind of gives a sense of what you could do with this kind of research. And then I'll give time for questions. I know that I'm kind of racing through really complicated stuff from a methodological level and from a statistical level. So do stop me, or we can come back to this at the end if anything was a bit rushed. So the first, I think probably it was our most kind of basic or straightforward question, was, did recovery look the same for everyone? And when I talk about recovery, this is kind of peri-traumatic recovery. So the exposure or the stressor was still going on. All of this was data collected during the 50-day conflict. People came in, I think we can see here that we've got from day 15 to day 45. So all of this was peri-traumatic responses. And we decided to do a latent class growth analysis to see whether we could identify heterogeneity within the sample. So what we're looking at here is the general population sample. And we did find heterogeneity. In other words, there were different courses of traumatic stress symptoms during that time period. And I think this is actually quite interesting, that there's been quite a lot of work of trying to identify heterogeneity, specifically in the PTSD field or the traumatic stress field. But most of that started, the kind of data collection would start post-trauma exposure. And so we'd see, for example, that the data collection might start, let's say, a month or 2 months after people were exposed, and then followed them up over some time. What we had here was during exposure, and we found that there was a group that we called them resilient. They might even be kind of resistant. That might even be a better way of thinking about them. But they had basically no symptomatology to begin with, and they ended with no symptomatology. And that was really pretty stable. There was no kind of slope in the data. We had also a recovery group. So they started kind of at moderate levels of symptomatology, but over time they reduced such that they ended up actually kind of, you couldn't differentiate them from the resilient group. Which does raise all kinds of questions about when should you measure when people are distressed during an ongoing period of stress. We then had a moderate group who started high. They ended up a little bit lower, but still with reasonable symptomatology. And then we had this group that were high. And the numbers actually, if you look at most of the PTSD trajectory literature, we usually find about a group of about 10% that are high. But what you usually find is a group of about 70% that are termed resilient, that are all really, really low in their symptomatology, if they have any at all. And actually, I think that kind of matches with our 73% that we see here, made up of both the resilient and the recovery groups. And for us, this raised all kinds of questions about, like I said, when should you measure? And if you assess too fast, you might find yourself intervening with a group that didn't need intervention. And that for me actually raises some questions. We often talk about this kind of active monitoring or watchful waiting period when we're talking about traumatic exposure. And this for me actually really does confirm that that's the right thing to do, that if we rush to intervene, we might get it wrong. The problem is that if we look here, this group at this point, we can't really differentiate between them on their symptomatology. So there is a question, can we find ways of figuring out who this moderate group are, who probably would benefit from some additional support, some stepped up support at an earlier stage rather than a later stage. So this was our first question, but then we kind of decided to get a little bit more busy with the data, I would say, and we were very interested in the network approach to traumatic stress or to mental health in general. And we ran a couple of studies looking at dynamic symptom networks. So you probably come across lots of these network analyses these days. They're quite popular. And most of them are being done in cross-sectional data, which is interesting and still worthwhile doing, but answers a very different question from dynamic network analysis, where we're looking at the relations between symptoms over the time periods, between the time periods in which you're measuring them. So for us, this is 12 hours. So we have a couple of papers. The first, we looked at the relation of PTSD symptoms with all other PTSD symptoms measured twice a day. But what I'm showing you here, which I think is actually really interesting, is the PTSD clusters. They are the DSM-5 PTSD clusters of intrusion symptoms, avoidance symptoms, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and arousal. These are all the blue symptoms that you're looking at, the blue circles. And then we also assessed a whole bunch of negative emotions. And we really wanted to see how PTSD and negative emotions are related in this, again, in this micro-longitudinal framework. There's quite a lot of research about emotions predicting later PTSD symptoms over the long term. And actually emotions, negative emotions, are part of the PTSD kind of concept or construction. And they used to be a predictor or a necessary criteria, the A2 criteria, that you had some kind of negative emotional response during the event, which has since been removed. But it's definitely a part of what we see, this kind of negative emotions. And we were really interested to see how they predicted each other, again, not over long time periods, but very, very short time periods, to see if we could understand how PTSD might build up. And we really expected that the negative emotions would predict PTSD. So if you had raised negative emotions at one measure, we expected that at the following measure, PTSD symptoms would also be elevated. And actually what we found was that the relationship went in the other direction. And for the most part, it was driven by the arousal cluster. And we can see this from what we call out strength versus in strength. The out strength is how much a variable predicts another variable at the next measurement, and the in strength is how much it's predicted by. And what we saw was that basically this arousal variable had the highest out strength, and it predicted all the negative emotions that we measured, except for guilt and shame. But we also saw that fear predicted all of the PTSD clusters at the next measurement. So again, PTSD is conceptualized often as a fear-based kind of a response. So we see something about arousal and fear really driving this kind of phenomenon. And what was interesting was that guilt basically dropped out of this network. It wasn't part of the system. And guilt is usually quite an integral part to PTSD, or the PTSD kind of, even the peri-traumatic responses. But in this case, it wasn't there. And I think that maybe it points to the importance of understanding the context in which you're measuring trauma, and who is seen as the perpetrator and where the person's place is within their own narrative of events. And I think for the most part, our participants didn't see themselves as being guilty in this. I think this was kind of exacerbated by an us and them kind of a narrative at the time, a political narrative. But guilt for them was not part of their response to this kind of phenomenon. I also want to talk just briefly about the way that we can kind of look at a kind of multi-level moderation, multi-level moderated mediation, but within this kind of ESM framework. So here we looked at the exposure to sirens. Did people hear a rocket warning siren? And how did that impact both on their sense of threat and on their stress symptoms? And we looked at the impact of having or not having an SMI diagnosis, and also gender in that. And we saw that being exposed to sirens was directly related to stress symptoms. We can see that kind of at the top. But we can also see that it's partly mediated by their sense of threat. And I think sense of threat is really, really important when we talk about trauma. And again, thinking about the current situation, I think that would make a lot of sense to people. How much people feel that their life is at threat, or that the life of their loved ones is at threat, I think is a really, really key variable, a key factor in their outcomes. Both the stress symptoms, I suspect also things like anxiety and depression, are really, really driven by how much they feel that they are being threatened. And the reason I think it's so interesting, not only in a kind of mechanistic level, but also think it's interesting because it's often something that we can modify. So sense of threat is obviously both subjective and objective. There are real threats, but it's also how much I perceive myself to be at threat. And there are some things that we can't change. But for example, things like using masks, washing your hands, following the rules can also really reduce people's sense of threat, as well as actual real threats and real risks in the population. And I think that if we focus on the role of things like sense of threat, if we can identify these mediators that impact the relation between real objective exposure to stressors and stress symptomatology or other kind of mental health outcomes, then that's really, really helpful. So that for me was a very interesting finding because of the meaning of sense of threat and because of what we can do with it. So just to recap that, what we saw from that study, and like I said, this is just an exemplar of the kinds of research you might be able to do, but it provides information about the real-time reactions that people have, but also about the interactions between different symptoms. We can kind of find these patterns between symptoms and start to think about the way that symptoms relate to each other and what we might want to target if we're targeting things at an early stage. We can also identify these risk and resilience factors, including obviously prior mental health diagnosis, but also all kinds of other things that I haven't included here that were relevant things about people's prior trauma exposure and gender, and all kinds of other things, some of which we knew and some of which were new kind of pieces of information. We can also look at high-risk groups, not just by thinking about risk factors, but actually trying to identify symptom patterns that might be problematic in the long term. If we can see what in the short term predicted later psychopathology, then if we can get a kind of snapshot picture of their symptomatology at an early stage, it's a real pointer towards what might happen down the line. And the last thing I think that's really important to say is that it was feasible. And I think when we started, we were not sure it was feasible to collect during a very high stress period, and also especially amongst the group with a psychiatric history. A lot of people said to us, oh no, you can't do that. And there was just absolutely not the case. People could absolutely provide this kind of data. They were happy to, and there was a little bit more dropout, but not really massively so. And so I think the assumptions that we make about groups that may or may not be able to complete studies, I think we have to run the studies to know whether that's true and not make these kind of assumptions about groups and their vulnerability and their abilities to complete questionnaires. And so for me, that was really important. And maybe some of this is obvious now, but even though it was only 6 years ago, I think it wasn't as obvious then. And so I guess it's really just a point to remember about groups and making assumptions about who might or might not participate. In terms of future directions, I think that this kind of approach has the potential to provide really useful insights into how people cope and respond during periods of conflict and crisis, and might also help us actually monitor how people are doing. We need loads more studies in different contexts at different stages during and after exposure. I think the population and the culture makes a massive impact on what we might see, and obviously also the actual traumatic situation. I think that some of this may well eventually be integrated into apps and websites, potentially providing these kind of just-in-time adaptive interventions. I do think we're really far away from that at the moment, although things are moving fast. When checked, people tend to make very different interpretations of these kinds of data, and there's a really interesting study, a many labs study, where the same ESM data set was shared with, I think it was 12 different labs, and they were asked to make clinical recommendations based on the data, and these clinical recommendations don't match up at all. So there's a real word of caution about how we handle the data, and certainly extrapolating from what we see to personal clinical recommendations, I think we've got a long way to go. Nevertheless, I do think that the clinical implications are potentially very, very helpful in terms of understanding risk, predicting risk as well, forecasting what is needed. So I think that there's lots of really positive directions. I would really urge some caution in assuming that we can now provide the kinds of answers we would hope to provide over time. There's lots of really good resources that I'd recommend. I'm going to leave this slide up just for a minute so that you can record it or look back on it. But there's also lots and lots of really usable things out there, lots of tutorials. I haven't added here, but I should have added that Olivia Kirtley's curating a repository of EMA items. They've also got a really helpful pre-registration template for EMA kinds of studies. So there's lots of very usable and helpful resources out there if people are interested in doing these kinds of studies in the future. And I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm happy to take questions. I don't know how you want to do this, if you want to just ask questions or if I look at the chat. Oh, I can't hear you, Hannah.
Oh.
There we go.
I was muted now. Awesome. That was such an interesting talk. Thank you so much. I think it's really relevant to a lot of the work that we do in this group, actually. Well, Andy has. Andy, do you want me to read your question, or did you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
I'm happy to ask if that's okay.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for that. Excuse me. I wonder what system you used for EMA?
In terms of data collection?
Yeah.
So we used Qualtrics, which is not necessarily the best platform to use, but I'll tell you why we used it. We used it because a few reasons. First of all, it was really usable in Hebrew. At the time, there were not many, there's lots of dedicated apps or collection platforms out there now for EMA studies. But at the time, 6 years ago, there weren't so many, and we didn't find anything that was very user-friendly for Hebrew, where it goes in the opposite direction. All of the things came up in the wrong place. So it was a really practical reason. It worked well for us, actually, and we still use it now when we run studies. I think a few things that might work less well in other contexts are that we use it by sending a link to people's email, and they click on the link and answer the questionnaires. But that works well if in Israel people have loads of data. People have tons and tons of data on their mobiles, so their data is always on and they are always getting their emails. But actually, I think in the UK, not everyone has that huge amount of data, and so you might find that people are switching their data off. So in that case, you would want one of the apps that can send a notification to people, even if they're not currently connected to Wi-Fi or the internet. So there are some things to think about. I know that a lot of people use, I think it's SciLife, and lots of people use MobiSense. And again, it depends also how you want to integrate it with passive data. If you do or you don't, that might affect what kind of data collection platform you choose to use. But we've used Qualtrics, and it's always worked well for us.
Okay, great, thanks. Do you have any idea roughly what sort of completion and compliance rates you got using Qualtrics?
I know what we got, and it was very high, but unusually so. We had almost no dropout. I think we had 216 people consented to participate, and we ended up with 182. But the dropout between the 216 and 182 all happened pretty much within the first day or two of the study. Almost everyone dropped out right at the start when they realised what it involved, and anyone who kept going until the end, and they're still going. I mean, we still have these people in the study, 6 years on. I think critically, two things. The first is that we paid them. We paid about $150, I think, per person for that month of data collection. And when we've gone back to them for future rounds, we've also paid them. So I think that was the first thing. And it's really worth thinking about when you do things with payment and what kind of payment and the payment structure. I can also discuss that with you afterwards with pleasure. We have done a study among recreational cannabis users where a couple of times where we've not paid them, and we've had really high numbers of people participating. And I think that goes to how much people are motivated to be part of the study. And if they think that, this is really meant very specifically for them, and they feel that they really have something to contribute, and potentially also they kind of feel like this speaks to their cause. In terms of, again, the study that we had, I also think we had high compliance because people felt very frustrated by the situation. Again, much as the current situation where there's not much you can do. And this was a chance, I think, to do something, to feel like they'd contributed to understanding the situation and potentially providing some support in the long term. And so I think that helped. And there may also be, and this maybe raises some questions, but there might be some kind of cathartic aspect to people asking you how you're doing, multiple times a day. Maybe also people actually get some benefit from that, which raises some methodological questions about, the reliability of the data. But putting that aside, I think that there is something that when people are going through a stressful time, they may actually want to take part in something where people are asking them how they're doing twice a day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. And one final question, if I may. Have you done any work with EMA captured using wearables, smartwatches, those kind of things?
I've not directly, although I've worked on data with people who were doing that, but I've not run that study myself as a PI, so I wouldn't want to speak too much about the way to do it. The main thing I think to be aware of when you do those kinds of studies is that the self-report data comes at discrete moments. So you have these assessments at very specific points in time. Whereas when you're using wearables, you're getting the passive data, which is being collected continuously for the most part. And so you have to figure out in advance, and I would really recommend doing it in advance, thinking about how you might match the data, this continuous passive data, where you've got, infinite data points, and matching it with very specific points in time where data are being collected. And some of the apps that exist, like MobiSense, for example, they have algorithms and they have support to help you translate the kind of, for example, sleep data into something usable that becomes a variable that you can then use to match against self-report data. So a lot of these, you don't realise how complicated the data are until you have them. So obviously it's quite hard to imagine, but that's why I think things like the pre-registration template might be particularly useful, because you go through the process of figuring out how you're going to analyse these really complex data sets before you actually try and do that.
Sure. Thanks very much. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Any more questions from anyone else? Not anything that's popped up in the chat yet. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting. I mean, there are two areas where this kind of intersects with what we're doing. One is, as Andy was alluding to, the actual EMA stuff that's going on using wearables, using phones, using watches, that kind of thing, which Andy, Jen, people like that are doing work on. And then there's how to analyze those data, which we have a number of colleagues within the epidemiology unit that we're interested in who are looking at, what other information you can extract when you have those granular data, and what that can tell you that conventional, just the average response over time can't tell you. So I think there's a good chance that those people will come back to you with questions. Hannah, I see there's a question from Maren that's just popped up.
Yeah, so Lauren's just asked whether you looked at the data as it was coming in, or if you just looked at the end.
No, we didn't peek at the data. It's difficult because that's one of the questions that we get a lot actually through the ethics process, is what do you do if, for example, we asked in one of the studies that we ran, we asked the PHQ-9 in a modified form, but we asked with the suicidal ideation question, the 9th question. And then people say, well, what do you do with that if you get responses and people are saying that they are having these thoughts? Shouldn't you intervene? And for the most part, or we say that actually we shouldn't, because that's not what we've told them that we'll do. But there are questions about what do you do with that real-time data? Do you have to make clear whether you're planning to look at it or not to the participants, because I think if they think that they're giving their data, and that somebody's looking at it in real time as it comes in and we know who it's come from, then there is a responsibility to get involved, and you might want to analyze it and do things differently. But we have always de-identified the data and stripped it of it. We don't ask their names, we've stripped it off their email addresses before we've then looked at the data. So we actually don't get that information, which I don't know, maybe it's a cop-out, but that's what we've done. I think that it depends what you're doing it for. If you're looking at a just-in-time adaptive intervention, you have to analyse it as you go along to understand. I mean, I guess you build an algorithm eventually, but we're not there yet, where you're building an algorithm based on this information that's coming in. I don't think anyone really knows what you're supposed to do at what point without having first done research. And so I think that it depends why you're doing the study, what your purpose is, as to when you choose to analyse the data. But no, the answer is that we didn't look at it as it came in. We waited until we had it, we transferred it to a different platform, we de-identified it, and then we looked at it.
Oh, thanks. I realised I couldn't unmute myself then. And also, Gareth has also asked a quite a long question, but did you decide a priori on the network approach over some sort of common factors approach?
Yeah, I think that we ran the study in a real rush. Just full disclaimer: we started collecting data on day 8 of the conflict, and we hadn't planned. We didn't know a conflict was coming, and we hadn't planned for it. The reason we managed to do it so fast is that we were already running an EMA study on people who'd had a car accident and were being recruited in emergency rooms, and we basically transplanted our platform for and all the questions that we had set up. We made a few changes to make it relevant, but basically we took an existing study and we used it in this context. And amazingly, we managed to get, I mean, we've got ethics approval and funding all within those first few days in order to be able to start on day 8, which means that we did some things a little fast. However, we definitely did have in mind the network approach. We, at the time, I mean, it was 2014. At the time, it was really, the network field was really at the beginning of its kind of conceptualization. And I think, if I'm not wrong, that there was a kind of theoretical dynamic networks approach, but I don't think anyone had yet actually run it on real data. So we kind of knew that we wanted to do this. That was what we had in our head when we ran it, but we didn't really quite know how we were going to go about doing it. And I have to say, it was a really long learning process in terms of handling the data and understanding the different possibilities, and also understanding how those different possibilities match to different research questions. All of that was quite a steep learning curve for our lab.
Yeah, Gareth, is there anything else you wanted to mention, or quite a long question?
Yeah, sure. I was just I didn't realise I could unmute myself because I'm dumb.
That's right.
That's super interesting. Thank you. Out of interest, what package or program did you use to do the modelling stuff?
We've used lots of different packages along the way as we've learned how to use different things to analyse the data. Mostly we now use M+. They've got M+ version 8 has got dynamic structural equation modelling analyses, which are really, really good for analysing these kinds of data, and especially for separating within and between person processes. They kind of allow you to take a latent estimate of a per person mean, and you can really separate between these within and between person processes. And for the network analyses and some of the multi-level modelling, we've used R. We used MLVAR in R for the dynamic network models, and LME and LME4 for the multi-level models.
That's wicked. Thank you. Cheers. It was a super interesting talk, by the way.
For the dynamic network models, I'm pretty sure that all my code is in the paper. So if you go to those papers, you can find, I think, definitely at least one of them, if not both. We've got the code there, and for some of the other stuff also we've got code, so you can see a lot of the analyses that we ran.
That's great. Thank you.
We just have one more question coming from Chris, who asks over what period of time were you collecting data from your participants?
So that study we collected every participant gave us 30 days of data twice a day, and we had this they did a baseline questionnaire when they came in and an exit questionnaire when they went out that looked more like traditional traditional questionnaires, and we had a couple of follow-ups at 2 months and 4 months that were just straightforward questionnaires, and then we did another EMA burst 18 months later and 42 months later, and like I said, now I don't even know how many months later we are now. We're 6 years later. So, we've had these kind of repeat data collections, and the last time we collected, we did send them a thank you, we're now done email, and, thank you so much for being in the study. You probably won't be hearing from us again. And then now with another crisis and some leftover funding, to be honest, we did contact them and said, would you be prepared? And actually a lot of people are prepared to do this. I think people see that this is helpful and valuable data, and they understand that they have a role to play in a really difficult and frustrating situation. I don't know how well it goes when people feel that they don't have anything to contribute, and if you're not paying them, I think those things are both really relevant.
Awesome, thanks. So I think that's it on the questions. Unless anyone else has got any final questions. And if not, I guess if we just thank Talya again for a super interesting talk. It was such an interesting study, so thanks for joining us remotely this afternoon. Talya.
It's really a pleasure, and I'm just sorry that it wasn't in person and I can't, chat with everybody.
No, that was really fantastic, and there's lots coming through in the chat just saying how much people enjoyed it, so that was really interesting. And like I said, there's a good chance that people might follow up with other questions or opportunities maybe for collaboration, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I'm very happy. Be in touch. I'm sure you've got my email address somewhere or other, and yes, please just get in touch, and I'm happy to just share materials and experiences and and discuss.
Brilliant. Well, and nice to see everyone. Thanks everyone for coming along, and have a good weekend and look after yourselves, and see you all